Welcome to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. My name's Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Now, before we get started today, a warning that the topics we'll be talking about are not suitable for children. If you have kids with you or in the car, you might want to put on some headphones or perhaps catch up later on.
Well, earlier this year, the movie Spotlight came out. Many people will have seen it. It's a great film. It won a slew of awards, including Best Picture at the Oscars. For listeners who haven't seen the film, it recounts an investigation by the Boston Globe's Spotlight reporting team in 2002 that exposed clergy child sexual abuse and the subsequent cover-up by the Catholic Church.
The Boston priests molested kids in 6 different parishes over the last 30 years. The church found out about it and did nothing. We haven't committed any long-term investigative resources to the case.
No, we haven't.
And that's the kind of thing your team would do.
Obviously, the church will fight us very hard.
Trying to get some background information.
I don't want you recording this in any way, shape, or form. Nothing.
Something that strikes you as you see this film is the fact that churches have this role in our communities. Whether you're someone who goes to church or not, it's really a part of community life.
So at the time the Spotlight scandal broke, the Boston Archdiocese was the 4th largest in the US. So if you were living in Boston at the time, you were most likely a member of either a local parish or connected in some other way through perhaps a Catholic-run school or hospital. But the Catholic Church and the church more broadly really represents something. It's meant to help the poor. It's meant to stand for justice and protect the vulnerable. It very often does that. But when it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, when it fails, you're sort of left asking, how do communities deal with that? How do they heal? How do people work through the trauma that's really multi-layered? It affects families and communities broadly.
Yeah, this is something that people all around the world actually are having to wrestle with. You know, I remember at the end of the movie, after the credits, there's this list of cities where clergy child sex abuse has been exposed, including, a bunch of Australian cities.
Yeah, it's worthwhile noting that this issue is widespread. It's not only geographically, but involves other organisations, religious or otherwise, that work with children. So in Australia, there's the Royal Commission underway into institutional responses to child sex abuse. And there's a broad range of institutions involved. Every week, it seems, there's new evidence and new testimony is given. And we learn with sort of fresh horror about lives that have really been devastated by this.
Yeah, this is really an ongoing issue for the whole of our society. But the movie was set 15 years ago. So, it kind of leaves you wondering what's happened since then in the place where all this started. Our producer, Karen Tong, actually went to Boston recently, and she got to speak to one of the key players in this original drama.
Yeah, I'm Mike Rezendes, and I'm a reporter with the Boston Globe Spotlight team.
Mike is one of the Spotlight reporters who broke the story of clergy child sexual abuse 15 years ago. He's still at the Globe, still part of the Spotlight team, and still committed to the work of exposing injustice.
We investigate wrongdoing whenever it comes to our attention, and we think we have a chance to correct things and make things better than they are.
It's a slow day in the newsroom, but we take the stairs up to the Globe's library where we can find a quieter space. The lift isn't working, and Mike jokes that since the Globe is moving to a new office space soon, they're just letting everything in this building go. So I have to sit a bit closer, and I'll do a quick sound check as well.
I'll turn my phone off because it's been going off all the time.
Sure. There's a strong thread of social justice throughout Mike's work. He was part of the Globe's investigation into the murky world of debt collection and reported on the abuse of mentally ill prisoners at Bridgewater State Hospital. What did surprise me is where this sense of social justice came from.
I think it probably comes from a lot of places, and interestingly enough, I think part of it comes from my upbringing as a Catholic. Some people would argue that Jesus was a crusader for social justice. I mean, he dealt pretty much exclusively with the poor and the plight of the poor and the fate of the poor. When I was growing up, the Catholic Church, their priority was fighting poverty and ending the death penalty. And the church changed quite a bit as I grew older, and its concerns were more along the lines of preventing abortion and sometimes to the exclusion of everything else. But when I was growing up, the church in America, the Catholic Church in America, was very concerned with social justice, and I'm sure some of that rubbed off on me. Also, I grew up in an era of protest and attempts to change society for the better, and I think growing up in that environment really influenced me.
So the Catholic Church had a significant influence on Mike's commitment to social justice, but it also helped him understand and expose injustice in the Catholic Church.
For instance, many people have approached me who are not Catholics, and with some wonderment they ask me and say, well, how could anyone leave their children alone with a priest? But of course, all of us on the Spotlight team at that time, we all grew up Catholic. I mean, we knew intuitively that the priest was the one person you would choose to leave your children alone with. The priest was the most trusted man in the community. The priest was a man of God. Of course you would trust a priest with your children. So we didn't have to waste a lot of time trying to figure out how that could happen. We just intuitively knew that it happened, and we knew why it happened.
When did you first realise that this was going to be a story that would really shake the Catholic Church?
Well, there was a point where I had a premonition that this was going to be a very, very big story, and I can tell you exactly when it was. You know, I spent many weeks interviewing victims of John Geoghegan, who was a serial pedophile priest who abused more than 150 children over a period of 30 years while being shuffled around 6 different parishes. And I learned a lot about the terrible things that he did, and I also learned that his superiors knew that he was abusing children and kept reassigning him to different churches where he abused more children. So there was a moment where, after learning all of that, I realized I hadn't checked on what John Geoghegan's specific assignment was when he was in his very last parish. So I was sitting at my desk, and I had all the annual church directories on my bookshelf, and I picked up the directory that would have John Geoghegan's last assignment, and I looked him up, and I followed the dotted line from his name over to assignment, and the assignment was altar boys. And I thought, my God, how could these people, how could the bishops, knowing that John Geoghegan was a serial molester, how could they assign him to the altar boys? And at that moment, I knew there was something very deep and very twisted happening in the Catholic Church, certainly in the Boston Archdiocese. But I thought that this was going to be, at that moment, I knew this was going to be a very big story.
It was a big story, one that unravelled across America and around the world.
I wrote stories about cover-ups similar to the Boston cover-up, both in New York City, in the Queens-Brooklyn Diocese, and also in Tucson, Arizona. And I started getting information about other cover-ups in other dioceses around the country. So it became clear, after maybe 6 months or so, it became clear that this was something systemic within the Catholic Church, certainly in America. And of course, all of us on the Spotlight team began to realize this with a sense of gathering horror, I guess you might say. Still, I don't think any of us knew how widespread the phenomenon was. I don't think any of us understood that this was really a global phenomenon. The Church, of course, is a global organization, a global religion. But this problem of covering up sexual abuse by priests exists all over the world, we now know. None of us could have foreseen that. None of us did foresee it.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. If you've just joined us, our producer Karen Tong is speaking with Mike Rezendes. He's an investigative journalist with the Boston Globe and was part of the team that exposed clergy child sexual abuse in that city.
When you're a poor kid from a poor family, and when a priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. How do you say no to God?
We've got 2 stories here. A story about degenerate clergy, and a story about a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Which story do you want us to write? Because we're writing one of them.
This act of covering up child sexual abuse, it conveys this idea that pedophilia can be treated, that sexual abuse can be forgiven, that it can just be dealt with as this internal matter. But it's not just a moral issue, a scandal, a crisis to be handled. It's a criminal offence.
Well, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in the Church. It does present itself as a paragon of morality, but yet it permits priests to abuse children. There's no other way to put it. If a priest is sexually abusing a child or a young person, and the organization doesn't do anything to stop him, then they're permitting it. And that, of course, is a grave injustice to the victims. I think part of the reason clergy sex abuse is so devastating for the victims is it's a double injury. In other words, sexual abuse is very injurious to a young person, but to have the perpetrator be a priest, someone who you were supposed to be able to trust, creates another layer of injury, and I would call that layer betrayal. So you have the psychological damage caused by the abuse, and then you have additional psychological damage caused by the fact that you've been betrayed by someone you were supposed to trust or be able to trust. So I think it's doubly egregious for the Catholic Church as an institution to allow the sexual abuse of young people to continue. And I say that because there are many things the Church could do to stop this, and here in the Boston Archdiocese, Cardinal Sean O'Malley has taken a lot of these measures. For instance, everyone who deals with children in the Boston Archdiocese has to undergo a criminal background check. And there are awareness classes for both children and adults. The problem is that the institution of the Catholic Church has not picked up on this and at least recommended that these measures be adopted in every diocese. Instead we have a study commission that is yet to issue any recommendations, and essentially 15 years later, we have a lot of talk.
It's true. There's been a lot of talk. But 15 years later, there's also a movie that has re-energized people to do more than that.
I think in other areas of the country and the world, the movie Spotlight has had the effect of being sort of a second Spotlight series and giving our work a second life. There's no doubt that the Spotlight movie has inspired another wave of victims and survivors to come forward and say, hey, look, this happened to me and it was wrong and we need to do something about it. And I think it's also put more pressure on the Catholic Church to do something about the issue.
Do you think that the Church can in any way redeem itself in that it could be trusted again to protect the vulnerable, to care for the needy, to uphold justice?
Well, the easiest way for the Church to restore trust in its ability to protect children is to do something about it. The Church still does very, very valuable work all over the world when it comes to working with the poor. And it's a shame to see some of that work compromised by, say, the fall off in donations because of the scandal around clergy sex abuse. But that's just another reason, I think, for the Church to deal with the issue in a very forthright and decisive way, which it has yet to do.
Reading back through the stories that were part of the Boston Globe investigation, I came across a letter written by Margaret Gallant to her cardinal. She writes things like, "Our family is deeply rooted in the Catholic Church, and I have a tremendous love and respect for you, Cardinal," but also writes about her tears and agony over the 7 boys in our family who have been violated. So you're nodding, so you remember this letter.
I'll never forget it.
Is Margaret's view something that you do come across, this sort of love for the Church but anger at exactly the same time?
Oh, sure. I think Marge Gallant's feelings for the Church, her love for the Church, her devotion to the Church, and her outrage at 2 cardinals who allowed Father John Geoghegan to continue molesting children is fairly typical. People do love the Catholic Church and they remain devout Catholics, but I think they're really angry that this has occurred and that the Church has not really taken significant measures to deal with it. I think as poignant as her letter is, I think her feelings are fairly typical.
Earlier in our conversation, Mike had mentioned that almost everyone he grew up with was Catholic. He described it as a tribal thing. They all went to the same church. There was a sense of identity and belonging. He probably knew people. He was probably friends with people just like Margaret.
I'm in a running club. Every Sunday we would go running. And there was a friend who was the devout Catholic and the principal of a high school, and he was, I think, upset at the stories. Recently, I got a very nice letter from him after the movie came out, and he wrote me and he told me how valuable he thought the work was, and he told me he thinks that all of the stories exposing this terrific injustice in the long run will make the Church a stronger church and a stronger institution. And I think he's right. I hope he's right.
You've been listening to Life and Faith from the set of Public Christianity, and today's episode came courtesy of our producer, Karen Tong, who was in Boston to record that interview. obviously heartbreaking stories that we heard there. But I guess we're grateful that efforts like the Spotlight story have brought this situation into the light and meant that change is not only possible, but it's happening.
Keep listening, because we have a bonus interview with Professor James O'Toole from Boston College coming up. He has some fascinating insights you won't want to miss about the role of the Catholic Church in Boston and how the scandal impacted the Catholic community there. And join us next week. We'll be kicking off a 2-part series on extravagance.
At the beginning of this podcast episode, Simon mentioned that the Catholic Church in Boston had this huge role, that at the time Spotlight broke this scandal of clergy sexual abuse, the Boston Archdiocese was the 4th largest in the US. This is actually a really important part of the story, so I thought I'd speak to an expert on this.
Okay, I'm James O'Toole. I'm the Clow Professor of History at Boston College. My research interests are in the history of religion in America in general and American Catholic history in particular.
What's interesting in Boston, Professor O'Toole says, is that the relationship between the Catholic Church and the city of Boston, the people of Boston, actually had a rocky start. The fact that it rose to such a level of prominence and power was
implausible, very unlikely that would have happened. When Boston is first settled in 1630 and after, there are no Catholics at all, and the settlers from England who came here at that time were not only non-Catholics, they were aggressively anti-Catholic. One of the reasons they came to Massachusetts Bay, these so-called Puritan settlers, was that they thought that the Church of England, which had gone through the Reformation, was still too Catholic, in a sense, that there were too many Catholic elements that, from the Puritan perspective, should have been purged away in the Reformation and weren't. So they were seeking to establish that kind of society and culture here. And one of the things they did was to pass a series of so-called anti-priest laws, which said that if a Catholic priest came to Massachusetts, he'd be thrown out of the colony. If he came back, he'd be thrown out again. And if he came back a third time, he'd be hanged. That's a measure of how much they wanted to separate themselves from the Catholic Church. Now, no priest ever tested that law. But I'm reasonably certain that if any had, the Puritans would have established it, would have enforced it. So I think given that background, it's very unusual that Boston became such a Catholic city. And that's the product of immigration, massive immigration to this part of the country in the 19th century, especially from Ireland and especially from Catholics. And that's what made this such a Catholic center.
By the time the scandal broke, the Catholic Church was integral to civic life.
There was a tremendous institutional infrastructure that was in place. Schools, hospitals, social service agencies run under Catholic auspices, all working in tandem with those under public offices. And so that made the leader of the Catholic Church in this area not just the leader of one particular church, but a broadly influential civic figure, comparable to the governor or the mayor, had that kind of public role. And Cardinal Law, when he came in 1984, building on his predecessors who had fulfilled that kind of role, he certainly embraced that sort of position. He was someone that anyone in the greater Boston area, whether they were a Catholic or not, whether they were the member of any church or not, would have recognized him and acknowledged him as a leader of this institution. Wouldn't necessarily have agreed with him on any given issue, but would have known that he was a figure of that stature.
So respected.
Yes, and I would say Cardinal Law also played to that role. He knew that was the kind of position that was expected of someone who was the Archbishop.
After the incidents of clergy child sexual abuse and the cover-up were exposed, this relationship changed. There was now a great distrust of this institution. There was tension between local parishes and the communities they were meant to serve. There were significant financial implications as well. In fact, the Cardinal's home and the church's seminary property was sold to Boston College, just across the road from Professor O'Toole's office. This was to meet court-mandated obligations. And Cardinal Law stepped down.
By the time he resigned, it was a popular decision. Many people were calling for his resignation for a long time before it actually happened, including, interestingly enough, some of his own priests who thought that he had mishandled these cases. So there was certainly a dramatic change in the way he himself was perceived. At the same time, this Catholic infrastructure of schools and hospitals and so on was so much in place, and, regular people relied on it for health care and for elderly care and for education of their children, that the position of the church was certainly damaged by it all, but not across the board. One of the most interesting things to me in that period was, in a sense, what didn't happen. In the height of the crisis in 2002, I'm aware of about half a dozen local parish churches in and around Boston in which weekly contributions from the parishioners went up, not down. Everything about the crisis should have led us to think that the opposite would happen, right? But instead it went up, and I think what was going on in people's minds there was they had completely lost confidence in cardinal law. They'd lost confidence in the hierarchy and sort of the leadership of the institution, but they were committed to their local parish church, and they showed that in that way. In a sense, they were saying, even after everything that's gone wrong from the leadership, from the people on top, they're not going to take my church away from me.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting because obviously some of these instances of abuse, it would have been in these local churches.
Absolutely. And I don't know. I suspect in parishes where there had been specific examples, that may not have happened. And, a sociologist wouldn't be satisfied with my my unscientific sample of churches. But again, I think it's remarkable the number of people who did not leave the church. And I think they were saying, in effect, no, this is my church as much as it is the church of the hierarchy.
What the professor's saying here reminds me so much of Margaret Gallant's letter. The fact that she could so clearly express her anger and outrage at how the church had hurt and abused 7 boys in her family, but also still love the church and remain in her faith.
All of this happens about 50 years after the meetings of the Second Vatican Council in Rome in the 1960s. This was a meeting of bishops from around the world to, as the Pope himself said, to bring the church into the modern world. And great changes in Catholic theology and Catholic practice came out of the council. The Mass in the vernacular language of the people, not in Latin, the prime example. But one of the things that the Vatican Council did was change the definition and central metaphor for the church. What the Vatican Council said was that the church was the people of God. Yes, it was hierarchy. Yes, it was institution. Yes, it was priests and sisters and pope and everybody else. But first and foremost, it was people. When the clergy sex abuse crisis hit, people had, ordinary parishioners, members of the congregation, had been hearing that people of God language for 50 years, and, maybe surprisingly, they believed it. I think, in a sense, that allowed them to say, there's a difference between the hierarchy of the church and the people of the church. There's a difference between cardinal law as the leader of the church and me as an ordinary parishioner. I think people had that sense, and that allowed them to be, or gave them permission, you could say, to be more critical of the institution than they probably would have been in the past, or their parents or their grandparents were. That, I think, indicates the kind of larger movement that was going on here.
In Boston, in particular, there are still the schools and the hospitals and so forth. Do you think that it can, again, be that trusted institution, whether here in Boston but also around the US?
The institutions of the church will still be in place here, and people will continue to rely on them for the direct basic services. Schooling for their kids, health care for themselves and their families. And, of course, also the religious encouragement that they get from being members of the church. So I think in that sense, the presence of the church will continue, but it will certainly be different. There won't be the same kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, blind faith in the institution. I think this whole experience for Catholics in Boston and the United States generally has been a sobering one. So, yes, people will still want those basic services, but they won't have the church on the same kind of pedestal that they might have before. And they'll be more attentive and more eager to hold the church leadership accountable. Ordinary Catholics are going to continue to be watchful on that subject.
You've been listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.